right, so get ready, because today we are going deep, really deep, into the life of Stanley Tookie Williams.
Tookie Williams, yeah.
Now, some of you might recognize the name as the co-founder of the Crips.
One of, if not the most notorious gang in the U.S.
But, and this is what makes the story so fascinating, he went from a life completely immersed in violence to becoming a, get this, Nobel Peace Prize nominee.
It's incredible.
We're going to be dissecting excerpts from his Wikipedia page to unpack, to try and understand how that shift happened.
How does someone go from, founding a gang like the Crips to being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah.
It's truly a story that begs the question, can people change? What is human nature all about? And you're right, we're not here to glorify gang life or to condemn anybody.
Right.
We're just here to explore this one individual and what made him tick.
Yeah, and, to kind of understand the forces that shaped him.
Exactly.
The choices that he made.
The choices he made and the legacy that he ultimately left behind.
So let's start at the beginning. Williams was born in Shreveport, Louisiana.
Right.
But his story really begins in South Central L.A.
Right.
And it's there that he moves as a child. So imagine a place where street fights, even dog fights, were just commonplace.
Oh.
And a young Williams, he quickly gets this reputation for being a pretty good fighter himself.
Really? So this environment really shapes him. This lack of structure, right? The exposure to violence, this need to prove himself, to be tough, to survive it all, becomes very deeply ingrained in him.
And it's in this context that the Crips emerge.
Right.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. Williams actually, he despised those youth gangs.
He did.
That were popping up at the time. He viewed them as predators, exploiting the weak.
Wow.
He co-founds the Crips.
He does.
He intended to create a force, like he said, to protect the community. But the irony is that it spiraled into the very monster that he initially sought to combat.
Oh, the irony. It's like, you set out to do something good and it just takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
So how does someone go from, absolutely despising these gangs to actually being a leader of one?
So how does he go from loathing gangs to leading one? We know he was physically imposing thanks to his weightlifting. He had that reputation for violence.
Right.
And then he makes that really critical alliance with Raymond Washington, another powerful figure at the time.
Yeah.
But is there something more at play here?
Well, think about how volatile the landscape of gang leadership was at the time.
Okay.
A lot of the early Crips leaders, they met very violent ends or they ended up incarcerated.
Oh, wow.
And this constant churn that really solidified Williams' position. It pushed him to the top.
Yeah.
In a very brutal, unforgiving world.
And for a time, he led this really strange double life.
Oh.
He was working as an anti-gang youth counselor.
What?
While simultaneously, he was this powerful gang leader.
Wow, that's almost like he was trying to make amends, to atone for his actions while still kind of participating in the system.
Yeah.
This duality couldn't last forever, though.
Right.
He ends up getting wounded in a drive-by shooting.
Oh, wow.
He suffers the loss of his grandmother. He loses his job.
Oh, no.
And he kind of spirals
Spirals.
into PCP use. And this downward spiral, that culminates in the 1979 murders.
Right.
The events that would lead to his death sentence.
The source material, it details these events, 2 robberies.
Okay.
And then the murders of Albert Owens, Yen Ye Yang, Sai Shai Si Yang, and Yu Chin Yang Lin.
Well.
And it lays it out in a very straightforward manner.
Okay.
And Williams, though, he always maintained his innocence.
He did.
But the physical evidence, specifically his shotgun, tied him to those crime scenes.
And that becomes the key thing, right? The crux of the case against him. But his story doesn't just end there.
No.
Over the years, there were tons of appeals.
Yeah.
And they focused on things like potential racial bias in jury selection.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And how the evidence was handled.
Right.
Now, on top of all that, there was his anti-gang activism from prison.
Right.
And then his multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominations. That really complicated the narrative.
It's almost like 2 separate stories converging.
It is.
You have the convicted murderer.
Right.
And then this figure who's advocating against gang violence, appealing to people's sense of hope and redemption. It's really no wonder that this case attracted so much attention.
It captured the public's imagination.
Yeah.
And it fueled this massive clemency campaign.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a legal battle anymore.
Yeah.
It was a moral and philosophical debate.
Right.
about the possibility of transformation, whether someone so deeply involved in violence could genuinely change.
And at the center of all of it was Governor Schwarzenegger holding Williams' fate in his hands.
Yeah, and despite those pleas for clemency, despite the arguments made during the appeals, Schwarzenegger ultimately denied it.
He did.
He did. And his decision hinged on what he perceived as a lack of genuine remorse from Williams,
Yeah.
like a missing piece of the puzzle of redemption.
So in 2005, Stanley Tookie Williams was executed.
Wow.
Witnesses described a really somber atmosphere.
Yeah.
His supporters, they offered Black Power salutes.
Interesting.
It's a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation.
Absolutely.
And then this outburst. The state of California just killed an innocent man.
Wow.
It pierces the silence.
It's a moment that really underscored the profound divisions that surrounded this case. Even in death, Williams remained a polarizing figure, a symbol of both hope and despair, leaving behind a legacy, really open to interpretation. But before we delve into those reactions and kind of unpack the complexities of his legacy, what are your initial sense? What are your first impressions? What aspects of this first chapter of Tookie's story stand out to you?
It's a lot to process. But that juxtaposition of his violent past with his later activism is jarring. And that question of whether he truly changed or was simply a master manipulator, it lingers.
It does, and those are questions that we'll continue to explore as we dive deeper into the final chapters of Stanley Tookie Williams' life.
It's interesting you bring up manipulation because that seemed to be a recurring theme throughout the appeals process and the clemency debate.
Yeah.
Some people argued that his anti-gang work was calculated, like a move to just escape execution.
Right.
While others saw it as genuine evidence of change. So how do we really determine, what constitutes a sincere apology or transformation, especially within the justice system?
Right.
If he had unequivocally apologized for those murders, would it have changed Schwarzenegger's decision? Or was there just something deeper, like maybe a belief that certain actions are just simply unforgivable?
It's a really good point. Schwarzenegger was pretty adamant about the lack of apology being a major factor.
Right.
But were there other considerations too, like the arguments about racial bias in jury selection?
Right, like 3 Black people were removed from that jury pool.
Exactly.
Which raises some serious questions about whether he received a fair trial.
And you can't ignore the social and political climate of that era.
Right.
We're talking about Los Angeles just a few years after the Rodney King riots, a time of such heightened racial tension.
Right.
In that context, it inevitably influenced the perception of the case and potentially even the legal proceedings.
And then there were those arguments about the evidence itself.
Oh, brief.
Williams's lawyers contested the methods used by that prosecution's firearms expert,
Okay.
suggesting that the link between Williams and the murders might have been a little bit weaker than it was presented.
So that's a key point. If that evidence connecting him to those murders was questionable, then it really casts doubt on the entire case.
Exactly. And then you add in the allegations of jailhouse informants being used to bolster the prosecution's case. If that's true, that's a pretty significant ethical breach.
Yeah, jailhouse informants are notoriously unreliable, often motivated by their own self-interest. It really makes you question the information used to convict him.
Were they telling the truth? Were they just trying to cut deals for themselves? It's a really disturbing possibility that further muddies the waters. It's like each layer we peel back reveals another layer of complexity. It's not just about Williams's guilt or innocence.
It's not.
It's about the flaws within the system itself, the potential for bias, the pressure to get those convictions, and the ethical lines that sometimes get blurred.
Williams's story becomes a microcosm of these larger societal issues.
Yeah.
The racism, the flaws within the criminal justice system, the yearning for redemption, and this question of whether our past actions should forever define us.
And that's what makes this deep dive so compelling.
Right.
It's not just a historical recounting, it's a reflection of ourselves.
Absolutely.
Our values, the difficult questions that we grapple with as a society. But before we get too philosophical, let's go back to Williams's activism for a second.
Okay.
He wrote several children's books.
He did.
To try to steer kids away from gang life.
He did, yeah. And they were actually really successful.
They were.
They were distributed in schools and used by anti-gang programs.
Wow.
It seemed like he was really trying to make amends for the path that he had chosen and the harm that he had caused.
But didn't he face criticism for that too?
He did, yeah.
People questioning his motives, saying he was still connected to the Crips, even maybe profiting off of his notoriety.
There was definitely pushback. law enforcement officials questioned his sincerity, especially since he refused to inform on other gang members.
Oh,
It's
wow.
like he was caught between two worlds,
Yeah.
trying to distance himself from that past, but still adhering to this code of silence. It seems like every step forward he was met with skepticism and resistance. So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory aspects of his life? The violence, the activism, the unwavering loyalty to the gang code, even while advocating against gang life.
Right.
That's the question, isn't it? Can someone truly transform? Are they forever shaped by their past? It's a question that really goes beyond Tookie Williams and makes us examine our own beliefs about redemption, forgiveness, second chances.
It makes you wonder if there's a point, where someone has done enough to really prove that they've changed, or are some actions just too grave to forgive?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, it really gets to the core of what we value as a society, how we define justice. Do we prioritize punishment or rehabilitation, retribution or forgiveness?
These are heavy concepts to wrestle with.
They are.
And they're made even more complex when you consider that this isn't some abstract philosophical debate. This is a man's life
Yeah.
hanging in the balance. And in the end, the scales tipped against him.
And that brings us to the final chapter, the execution itself and the aftermath that continues to kind of ripple through society, even today. Before we dive into that, though, is there anything that's particularly struck you about this middle phase of his life?
I think what stands out to me is this constant push and pull between hope and despair.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have this man seemingly trying to make amends, and on the other, you have these lingering doubts.
Yeah.
About his sincerity. It's like a constant battle between who he was and who he was trying to become.
Yeah, it's a story filled with contradictions, and that final chapter is just as impactful.
It is. It really is. I mean, this case attracted global attention. Think about figures like Snoop Dogg and Jamie Foxx. I mean, they were pleading for clemency. That speaks volumes about the level of fascination with this case and the debate surrounding Williams.
It was a media frenzy, and for good reason, right? It wasn't just about a legal outcome. It became a referendum on this very concept of redemption. Could society accept that someone who'd committed these heinous acts could truly change?
Right. And in the end, Schwarzenegger said no.
He did. And what were the reactions to that decision? I mean, outrage mostly from Williams's supporters. They felt like his transformation had been ignored. And the chance for, a really powerful message of redemption was lost.
Yeah. His execution must have been incredibly tense. What was the atmosphere like?
It was somber. Witnesses said that Williams himself was calm. He didn't offer any resistance. But there was this definite undercurrent of tension. This wasn't just another execution. It was a culmination of years of legal battles and moral debates and fervent activism.
And then right at the end, that outburst from someone in the crowd, the state of California just killed an innocent man. It's chilling even now.
It was a stark reminder of how deeply divided people were, how divided opinions were about this case. Even in death, Williams remained this figure of controversy.
So he's gone, but the story doesn't just end there. What happened after the execution?
Well, there was a massive funeral in L.A., attended by thousands of mourners. I mean, you had this mix of gang members, celebrities, religious leaders, and then just everyday people. It was a really unique gathering.
Wow.
I mean, it reflected, the many different facets of Williams's life and the impact that he had on so many.
And Snoop Dogg recited a poem,
Right.
a reflection on Williams's life and what he represented.
He did. It was a really poignant moment. The poem, it acknowledged the darkness of Williams's past, but also emphasized the hope that his transformation offered.
Right.
It really encapsulated that struggle between judgment and forgiveness that so many people grappled with.
It's amazing how this case, which originated in California, had these repercussions, worldwide. Didn't Schwarzenegger even face backlash in his native Austria?
He did, yeah. There were calls to strip him of his Austrian citizenship.
Really?
He ended up cutting ties with his hometown of Graz, demanding his name be removed from a stadium there.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It shows how deeply this case resonated with people around the world.
A local case with global implications. It speaks to the power of this story. Even now, years after his death, we're still talking about Tookie Williams.
Exactly. His life, it raises these really enduring questions about crime and punishment, about, the possibilities and the limits of redemption, and about the role of race in our justice system. It forces us to confront, some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society.
And you mentioned that his children's books were actually quite successful. Are those still available today?
They are. And they're still used as a tool to deter kids from gang life. It's almost like a part of Williams' legacy that lives on, a testament to his desire to make amends for his past.
It's pretty remarkable that even after everything, a part of him is still working towards the good. So here we are, years after his death, still grappling with the complexities of Tookie Williams.
We are. Was he a truly reformed man? Was he a manipulator? Was he a victim of circumstance? I think the answer lies somewhere in between. In those gray areas, those gray areas that make us uncomfortable, but also force us to think critically and challenge our assumptions.
It's a story that forces us to confront, the very nature of good and evil, the potential for change, and the often imperfect nature of justice.
I think the best we can do is approach this story, and others like it, with a willingness to learn, to question, and to acknowledge that there are rarely easy answers.
So there you have it. The life and death of Stanley Tookie Williams, a story as compelling as it is controversial. We hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives and maybe even sparked a few questions of your own.
And if you're interested in learning more, there's a wealth of information out there, books, documentaries, articles. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep digging, keep diving deep.
Because that's what the deep dive is all about, equipping you with the knowledge and insights to engage with the world around you in a meaningful way.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.